Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll continue now where we left off yesterday on the program, reading the book Rome and Civil Liberty by James A. Wiley. There was a commission of inquiry sent to the Jesuit-run school in Maynooth in Ireland to ascertain what the school taught as regards the papal power and his ability to depose the king, or the queen in this case. And we discovered that through very twisted means, the Jesuits, because of the astuteness of their questioners, had to admit the Pope still maintains the power to seat and unseat kings. Now, they deny that he has temporal jurisdiction over the Queen, and they deny that he has either direct or indirect jurisdiction, but the Pope has a spiritual power, an unlimited spiritual power, and that though he may suggest that it's time for the king or queen to go, that has the power of infallibility. It's as if God were speaking, and the effect is the same, whether it's delivered under a temporal authority or whether it's delivered under a spiritual authority. It is the authority, nonetheless, to unseat the king or the queen, to depose the king, to depose any sovereign in the world. That's right, the Pope governs over the kings of the earth, just like the Bible says. He reigneth over the kings of the earth. And we see in history this diabolical Antichrist power, and it was uncovered in England by James A. Wiley and the interrogators. It's never spoken of in that light, but the papacy is the Antichrist of the Bible, plainly. So they finally questioned these Jesuit casuists to the point that the truth finally comes out. By whatever power the effect that the Pope has, the effect is the same. The Pope has the power to seat and to unseat kings. Now, James A. Wiley continues on page 173, if you're following along in your own online copy of the book. In the next to the last paragraph, it says, "So at last the truth comes out, and very clearly, too. The Pope has no direct temporal authority. He has no indirect temporal authority, but he has a spiritual power which he exercises over temporal matters for temporal effects. He has the power of direction in all matters in which duty is involved, and in what matters is duty not involved. This direction is authoritative and infallible. To the Roman Catholic, it is the command of God. He dare not oppose it to the he dare not oppose to it the conclusions of reason. He dare not confront it with the rights of conscience. He has but one recourse. He must obey, or dreadful alternative, be damned eternally." So if a Roman Catholic has been bound by some spiritual authority of the Pope that the king or queen must be deposed, he must assent 100% to that decision, or he faces eternal damnation. That's the power that the Pope has over every individual Roman Catholic. When the Pope speaks, it's as if God speaks, and when the Pope speaks, every Catholic must obey, or he falls into mortal sin. And according to Roman Catholic canon law, if you do not repent of your mortal sin, you are damned eternally. Now he says a spiritual consideration is this eternal damnation, doubtless. But it is a spiritual consideration which carries with it to the poor papist a coercive power so overwhelmingly irresistible that the prisons and scaffolds of kings are, in comparison, impotent and futile. Okay? The damnation of the Pope is much more to be feared by any Roman Catholic than any prison or any scaffold of the secular government. So, Roman Catholics, devout Roman Catholics, obey their Pope, even at the uprising against a king or a queen. They don't fear the state. They fear the Pope. Okay, so this is why it's conclusive that no Roman Catholic can be considered a loyal citizen of any country. So should at any time the Pope fall out of favor with the government, or the government fall out of favor with the Pope, and the Pope decides that the people should be ruled by another, then the people are obliged, spiritually, eternally obliged, to assist in that effect, to assist in the overthrow of the government. This is exactly why no papist should serve in government. This is why no papist should serve in the court. This is why no papist should have any position of authority in any country, because their first loyalty, on pain of excommunication and eternal damnation, is the Pope. They cannot be trusted. All right? When their allegiance is to the man in Rome, they cannot be a legitimate citizen of any country in which they live. Now the Pope then, Pope Pius IX, who was the Pope at this time, just as really as Pope Innocent III, his predecessor, retains the right and the power to depose sovereigns. But he exercises that power not by an act of jurisdiction, but by an act of direction. As the infallible director of consciences, it belongs to him, the Pope, to say, simply as a question of morals, and for the purpose of directing the faithful to a point of duty, whether kings have a valid title to their throne. But what in his mouth is a piece of purely spiritual direction speedily becomes in the hands of those to whom it is addressed an act of purely physical force. Verily it appears to us to matter very little to the sovereign who loses his throne, whether it be by temporal jurisdiction or by spiritual direction. Either way, the result is the same. His throne is lost. Now, I want my listeners to stop and think about all the presidential assassinations throughout the history of this country. Who would be most likely responsible for the assassination of our presidents? Well, of course, the one who reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, I would direct my listeners at your leisure to read two books written by Bill Hughes, a historian. His books are entitled The Secret Terrorists and The Enemy Unmasked. They're free online. You can read them for yourself at your leisure. Just Google the titles and read those books. The Secret Terrorists and The Enemy Unmasked. They're two different books. They go together, and they are real eye-openers. And after reading those books, you will come to the same conclusion that I have, that the Pope has exercised his temporal power over the sovereigns of this country repeatedly, and has deposed those kings by assassination. And you will be convinced. Now, returning to the book, this portion of the chapter is entitled Maynooth, a sure and ingenious way of releasing subjects from their allegiance. Okay? The Pope can not only depose the king, or the queen, or the president, but he can direct the consciences of the citizens of every country, and through just an ingenious way as he does to overthrow the king, he can absolve the citizens from any allegiance to their civil governments. Okay? He has a 1-2 punch. He can either take out the king directly or indirectly, as the Jesuits would say, or simply tell the people they have no obligation whatsoever to obey the civil power. In other words, incite national rebellion and thereby overthrow the king. All right, he's going to describe this now. He says, we advance to another branch of our subject. The right of the monarch to reign has its correlative in the duty of the subject to obey. And the power that claims authority over the one must of necessity claim an equal authority over the other. We have just shown that the pontiff exercises the right of saying when the monarch's title is valid. We now proceed to show that on the admission of the Maynooth professors, on the admission of Jesuit priests at Maynooth, the Pope exercises the right of saying when the subject's allegiance is binding. Let it be here once for all observed, in order to meet the ignorant objections sometimes urged in behalf of the pontiff's, quote, direction or, quote, advice, unquote, to the effect that, after all, it is much on a level with the direction and advice which a Protestant minister may address to his members of his flock, that so far is this from being true, there is all the difference in the world betwixt the two. Okay, now some are going to say, as James A. Wiley so articulately tries to tell us, that some are going to argue that the Pope has no more power than a Protestant pastor. Okay? And this is untrue, and we're going to prove it. He says the Pope's advice, simply as the Pope's advice, binds the conscience of the papist. The Protestant pastor's advice, simply as the Protestant pastor's advice, has no binding power whatever. The Protestant exercises his right of private judgment. He tests the quote-unquote direction of his pastor by the Bible, the infallible director of conscience and the supreme standard of duty. All right? That's what the Bible is to a Protestant. The infallible director of the conscience and the supreme standard of duty. And every true Protestant, every true Bible-believing Protestant does not, as a Roman Catholic, sit in front of that pastor and swallow everything the pastor says, hook, line, and sinker. Protestants, when they sit in their churches and listen to their pastor speak, know in their heart of hearts, know in their mind, in every fiber of their body, this is just a man. And he is subject to the same authority as is every other Christian, the authority of the Bible. And what your pastor says must pass through the sieve of Holy Scripture before it's accepted as truth. Every Protestant has a conscience. Every Protestant has Christ as his head and has the Bible as the truth. And everything in the Protestant world must fit through the Bible in order to be considered true. That's not true in the Roman Catholic Church. In the Roman Catholic Church, the priest is not to be questioned. He's a representative of the Vicar of Christ, the infallible director in Rome. And what the priest says is not to be questioned. It is to be as if God spoke. So, the Roman Catholic priest can bind the conscience according to Roman Catholic canon law. And then that individual whose conscience has been bound by the priest must satisfy the priest to have his conscience released. Not so in the Protestant world. So anybody who says that the Pope carries no more authority than a Protestant pastor is just plainly lying through his teeth. There is a distinct and diabolical difference with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, every Protestant tests the direction of his Protestant pastor by the Bible, the infallible director of conscience and the supreme standard of duty. If he finds the course enjoined at variance with the Word of God, he holds it to be of no force whatever. For it is a first principle of Protestantism that the man who gives and the man who receives this direction are both alike bound to bow to the supreme authority of the Bible. But with the papist, it's not so. He has no right of private judgment. He has no standard by which he can or dare try the Pope's direction. There's no higher authority to which he can carry his appeal. The Pope's direction is final, is infallible, and is divine. The man who resists that divine authority sins mortally. Okay? A mortal sin is committed when a Roman Catholic questions the authority of the Pope or his priest, his vicar, if you will. And continuing to resist perishes everlastingly. All right? That's what a mortal sin is in the Roman Catholic Church. You've committed a mortal sin in using your right of private judgment and judging contrary to the Pope, the voice of God on the earth. You have committed a mortal sin, and unless you recant and satisfy your priest that you have recanted, then you remain in mortal sin. And if you die, then it's curtains for you, or rather flames, eternal flames. Now stop and think how much power the priest has over the individual Catholic. Conscience doesn't enter into this. This is strictly a legal arrangement. The Catholic is the subject. The priest is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords because he represents the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in Rome. All right, in short, there's all the difference betwixt these two cases which there is betwixt a rational being whom you influence by reason and a machine which you move by main force. Okay? So there is absolutely no similarity between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. They are diametrically opposed systems. They are built on two different foundations. Protestantism, the one, is built on the rock and the foundation of Jesus Christ and the Bible. Roman Catholicism is built on the foundation of a human institution, not ordained of God, and is cursed throughout the Bible. Now he says, we return to the question of the allegiance of the subject. Dr. Moriarty, no doubt a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest at Maynooth, Dr. Moriarty is still before the commissioners. He is asked the question, quote, are there no circumstances under which the Pope could release a citizen from his oath of allegiance? Answer, most emphatically I say, none. Unquote. This is recorded, Volume 2, page 128 of the report. It seems a most unqualified denial, says James A. Wiley, of all releasing power on the part of the pontiff. It was meant, doubtless, that it should be taken as such, but let us mark the sophistry of the reply. Dr. Moriarty continues, quote, but as our greatest constitutional lawyers, and as I think our best theologians, hold that there are cases when the allegiance of the subject ceases, and when the government of the country may be justly overthrown. I consider that the Pope is the fittest authority to decide in many cases whether such circumstances have arisen. In many cases, he could not decide, and I firmly believe that in such cases he would not undertake to do so. In no case can he cause the allegiance of a subject to cease his power in such a matter, being simply declaratory, not enabling, unquote. Let me read the last phrase again. In no case can he, that is the Pope, cause the allegiance of a subject to cease, his power in such a matter being simply declaratory, not enabling, unquote. This is recorded volume 2, page 129 of the report. Now, James A. Wiley says, we wish the reader to mark the latter part of the answer and tell us, if he can, what is the difference in their practical result betwixt these two methods of annulling the allegiance of the subject. The Pope's power in such a matter, Dr. Moriarty informs us, is not enabling. It is declaratory. In other words, the Pope cannot make a monarch's title invalid. He can only declare it invalid. He cannot annul the allegiance of the subject. He can only declare that it is already annulled. Do you get it? The Pope, the Pope cannot make a king or a queen or a president's title invalid. He can only declare it invalid. He cannot annul the allegiance of the subject. He can only declare that it is already annulled. That he means this, and simply this, Dr. Moriarty makes, if possible, still more undoubted and clear by his answer to the following interrogatory. Listen carefully. Then it, the decision of the Holy See, that is, would have the effect of releasing the conscience of a subject from an obligation which the oath of allegiance had imposed upon him before, would it not? Answer, it cannot, replies Dr. Moriarty, effect a release. It can simply inform the conscience that a release is already effected. Volume 2, page 129. So then, when Romanists affirm that the Pope has no releasing power, they mean that he has no such releasing power as is enabling, but that he has a releasing power which is declaratory. He cannot, say they, make the allegiance of the subject non-existent. He can only declare that it is already non-existence. This is a very nice distinction, or rather, we ought to say it's a very contemptible quibble. So long as it pleases the Pope to hold a sovereign as a lawful sovereign, he has no power, say the Romanists, and we may add, he has no motive to release his subjects from their allegiance. But whenever it suits the Pope's infallibility or policy to hold that the sovereign has ceased to be a lawful sovereign, then his subjects are told that their oaths of allegiance no longer exist. The Pope, let us mark, does not say, quote, I release you from your oaths, unquote. He's careful to tell us that he has no power to do that. He possesses only the power of declaring authoritatively and infallibly that they are already released. Do you see the sophistry of Jesuitism? Now stop and think that these Jesuit schools, who educate Jesuit-trained politicians, now control our government. They're the highest political offices in this country. Who do you think they obey? You or the Pope? We'll be back right after this.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. And if you'd like to support Inquisition Update and keep this program on the air, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors it. If you'd like to contact me, I encourage you to do so. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. That's waves with a C, right? tom@seawaves.us. Now, if you're a Jesuit-trained politician in this country, no matter what office you occupy, and you've been trained in these Jesuit casuistries and sophistries, what do you most fear? That the Pope, in some casual conversation in Rome, might happen to say at one point and get reported in this country, or at least voiced about, that well, the Pope thinks the President of the United States has lost his right to rule. or that situations are such in the United States that the people have lost their allegiance to obey the government. That becomes law. That becomes binding upon the conscience of every Roman Catholic. James A. Wiley continues, he says, the Pope, let us mark, does not say, quote, I release you from your oaths, unquote. He's careful to tell us that he has no power to do that. He possesses only the power of declaring, authoritatively and fallibility nonetheless, that they are already released. Yet we must not say that the Pope has deposing power or wishes to have it. None but very wicked people say so, and these will, in time convenient, receive from canon law the due reward for their sayings. The Pope possesses no power in the matter except the poor right of saying that a sovereign has ceased to be a sovereign and that his subjects have ceased to be his subjects, and so quietly opening the door, or rather permitting the door to open itself for all that may follow. And this is how regime change happens in the world. It comes from Rome. It comes from Rome. He still reigns over the kings of the earth. He still overthrows governments. He still releases subjects from their allegiance to their country. Now, he doesn't do it as openly as his predecessor, Pope Innocent III, who made no bones about it. I declare this king, his kingship annulled, and I declare the sovereignty of the people to be done away. No, he does it more subtly now. He's learned to become more like the serpent through the ages. More subtle, but nonetheless just as authoritative as ever. Now he continues, it's hard to determine whether we ought to be more astonished at the impudence of the men who can juggle in this way, or at the simplicity of the men who are deceived by such juggling. Suppose instead of the despoiling a monarch of his own crown, it were a case of common robbery. The accused is put upon his trial, and he defends himself by saying, quote, I never touched a penny of that man's property. In fact, I never saw him to his face before. I simply expressed my honest opinion to these men, my followers, that I had a better right to his possessions than he had. And straightway, by some means or other, for which I disclaim all responsibility, his goods were transferred from him to me. Or let us suppose that it is a charge of murder, and that the person accused says, quote, I protest that I never spilled a drop of that man's blood or injured a hair of his head. In truth, I carry no sword wherewith I could do injury to anyone. I simply chalked a death's head and crossbones upon his door, and soon thereafter he became non-existent. I take nothing to do with the practical interpretation given to my well-understood sign by my hired and sworn assistants. If they mistook the counsels of spiritual direction for the commands of temporal jurisdiction, that's no affair of mine. Unquote. Now do you see the example that I gave the other day? Bill Clinton, in order to achieve the assassination of William Cooper, all he had to say to his Jesuit-trained assistants, Bill Cooper is the most dangerous man in America. and Bill Cooper was dead. That's how the Pope operates today. That's how Roman Catholics in government operate. That's why they are so careful and scripted in what they say. All right? You getting a better idea of what you actually are looking at when you watch these politicians on television? They know who they fear, and it's not God. It's the Pope. Any one of them knows just a casual suggestion by the papacy, and they're done. Their history, their careers are over. They may even be assassinated. That's what's learned by politicians in these Jesuit educational institutions. The Jesuit, Georgetown, Fordham, Boston College, you name them. All 28 of them. And they're trained early, even in the high schools. 300 Jesuit-run high schools. They take the cream of the intellectual crop of this country and they twist their minds into being papal automatons. And they put them in government. And they don't care a whit what you think of them. They only care what their spiritual director thinks of them. The Pope still rules over the kings of the earth. He rules over all the governments. And nowhere more so than the United States of America. Just as he controlled the government of Britain, he controls the government of the United States of America, and more so. Britain for a long time fought for its Protestant principles. America almost never did. One of the first institutions of higher learning in this country was Jesuit Georgetown University. It was built and erected by the very first Roman Catholic bishop in this country, a Jesuit priest, John Carroll. And it's been in the business of grooming politicians for this country ever since its inception. And the most powerful people in Washington, D.C. are graduates of these institutions run by the Jesuits. Now, the defenses supposed would be every whit as good as those which the Romish theologians are accustomed to make of the Pope's very clever and ingenious method of deposing sovereigns. The next portion of the chapter is entitled, Showing How Rebellion May Be Preached According to Maynooth. Okay? Now we're going to show how this Jesuit university instructs its graduates how the people may be brought to rebellion against their government. He says, Popery, age after age, retires deeper and deeper into the darkness. In proportion as the light increases, that is the gospel, the papacy drops thicker and yet thicker veils betwixt itself and the world. Whenever its designs are in danger of being discovered, it folds over them the skirts of its sable mantle. If still they shine through, it doubles the folds. It would appear thus to quit the scene of human affairs, but in reality it is all the while in virtue of its invisibility going deeper into the very heart of them. The papacy is neither a less influential nor a less meddlesome thing at this day than it was centuries ago, but it is a far subtler and more invisible thing than it was then. Pope Innocent III sat openly upon his throne, and whatever he did boldly and defiantly, neither disguising his acts by pretext or excusing them by apologies. He governed with a bold truculence, which inspired respect after a fashion, while it awakened universal dread, and extorted universal worship, making kings bow as low before his footstool as the poorest peasant in all their dominions. But the papacy of our times has transformed itself into a spirit of darkness. It no longer permits the world a sight of its proper visage. It maintains no doubt the shadow of its former pomp. It places upon the 7 hills a piece of imbecility as its representative, the senility of which helps to persuade men that itself has become senile. But the papacy, immortal in its malignities, and gathering increased strength from its increased experience, has retired behind the scenes that it may the more completely govern a world which it affects to have forsaken. It sits in all consciences. It prompts, instigates, and compels all to serve it. And working by others' hands, it disavows the strifes, revolutions, and bloodshed which are its handiwork. Its newest contrivance is to substitute past time for present time, and to refuse all responsibility for its proper actions by pleading, when they become actions de facto, that they are done de jure a year or a dozen years ago. Is a country convulsed and a sovereign deposed by violence? That's no rebellion. For in the judgment of Rome, the sovereign who has now been deposed de facto was already deposed de jure. His subjects who have taken part in his overthrow have not violated their allegiance in the least. For how could they violate what had long before been non-existent? This is the doctrine which we give £30,000 annually to have taught to the students at Maynooth, in order that they may teach it to their followers all over Great Britain and her colonies. And should that doctrine come to be acted upon some of these years, as why should it not? What reply should we be able to give when told, quote, "You sanctioned that doctrine when you endowed an institution to teach it, and why should you object to your carrying out what you yourselves were at such pains to have taught?" Unquote. Do you see where I said before? England was hiring its own inquisitors. England was paying its own mercenaries to overthrow the government. That's what they did when they endowed that Jesuit school in Maynooth. And that's what we do when we endow 28 such institutions of Jesuit learning in the United States of America. Is there any hope for this country unless we wake up to what is really taught in these Jesuit schools? No hope whatsoever. We don't have to worry about Muslim invasion. We have born and bred and educated our own assassins in this country. And we have no one else to blame but ourselves. No one else to blame but ourselves. He says, how adroitly Maynooth teaches men the proper time and circumstances in which to rebel may be seen from the following interrogatories and replies. The same witness, the same Dr. Moriarty, is still before the commissioners. Quote, "Suppose the case of a conflict arising in this country between the subjects and the crown upon a question warmly agitated, and with respect to which some persons were inclined to overstep the limits of allegiance and plunge into rebellion. In such a case, would the Pope, if not appealed to, have the power of declaring that such a state of things had arisen that the Irish people professing the Roman Catholic religion might rebel against the English sovereign?" Answer: supposing the Pope in full possession of the circumstances, he has power to declare to us what the natural and divine law prescribe as our conscientious duty. Quote, Has he authority to issue a declaration without being appealed to, which would terminate the obligation of the oath of allegiance? Answer: the appeal adds nothing substantially to his right or power. It merely puts him in possession of facts. His declaration cannot terminate the oath of allegiance if it has not been already terminated by the force of circumstances. He can merely make known the fact that those who were ignorant of it or who doubted it. Question: would his declaration in any matter augment the right to rebel or in any manner relax the duty of obedience? Answer: certainly not. But he can teach men when they should obey and by a necessary consequence when they may rebel. Unquote. The Pope then possesses the power of giving judgment in the supposed case, although no appeal may have been made to him by the parties, and his judgment, when adverse to the sovereign de facto, has this exact amount of power in it, that it does not command men to rebel. It only teaches, quote, men when they should obey and by a necessary consequence when they may rebel, unquote. The Romanist body in Great Britain still continue to submit to, although they can scarce be said to obey, the law. Are we therefore, it may be asked, entitled to conclude that their allegiance remains unaffected and entire, and that it is resting upon them as a positive duty? And are we to infer that the eye of Rome and the Roman jurist, the Queen, is regarded as the sovereign of Great Britain de jure, and not simply a sovereign de facto? By no means. In the Maynooth examination, the release of English papists in the days of Queen Elizabeth was touched upon, and the principles which regulate Romanists in all such cases were brought into view. Quote, a release from obedience, says Dr. Moriarty, does not imply an obligation to disobey. There might be, he added, prudential reasons for continuing to obey, even though not bound to do so, unquote. Dr. Moriarty was farther asked, quote, at the same time, if a man were disposed to transfer his allegiance or give it up, that decision of the Pope would enable him to give it up with a safe conscience, would it not? Yes, he replied, for a Catholic should feel his conscience at rest when acting in accordance with a decision of the Pope, unquote. Taking these statements into account, says Wiley, the likelihood, indeed the almost certainty is that the Romanists of Great Britain are at this hour released from their allegiance, if not by a formal sentence by the Pope, yet by the understood interpretation of Roman Catholic canon law applicable to their position, although for prudential reasons, as Dr. Moriarty says, they continue, quote, to obey even though not bound to do so, unquote. It is material to observe, in fine, that the Maynooth evidence was supervised at Rome before being published in our country, and consequently it expresses the opinion not merely of the Maynooth professors, but of the Pope and the Sacred College of Cardinals. So James A. Wiley's clearly describing to people that because of the papal aggression and the installation of bishops and the establishment of dioceses within Great Britain, within England, that the Queen was already overthrown de facto and overthrown de jure, and that Catholics could either obey or not obey her authority, because the Pope had already established his own form of government in the country. So it became a matter of expedience. Am I about to lose my head from the crown? then I'll obey the crown until such time as it becomes expedient for me to disobey the crown and obey the Pope. This is how governments are overthrown all over the world. This is how our own government is overthrown. And it's been overthrown a long time ago. It's been overthrown several times. This is how our presidents are assassinated. Every nation that has Roman Catholicism practicing within it is subject to the same overthrow, by the same means, by the same Roman Catholic canon law, by the same Jesuit sophistry and casuistry. You know, Satan knows no law but his own, and neither do the Jesuits, and neither does the Pope. Individual Roman Catholics, if they take seriously their Catholicity, have nothing of God binding on their conscience either. Roman Catholicism is what the Bible says it is, a whore. She's up for sale. She has no true spouse, and uses every art of deception, every art of beautification of herself to lure men in. And she runs a thriving business in the world, and nowhere more thriving than in the United States of America. James A. Wiley continues, he says, "We see against what a subtle foe the nations of Europe, now fighting for their independence, have to contend. Truly it may be said of them, and of our own nation among the rest, that they, quote, wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, and against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." I ask my listeners, where's the highest place in the world today? It's the papacy, the center of all spiritual darkness. He says the papacy has gone deep indeed into the darkness. Thick clouds encompass it, through which mortals cannot gaze. But from the midst of the gloom and the silence in which it sits, it launches its bolts upon the world. Its hand is not seen, but the stroke is all the more sudden and sure. If the bolt is invisible, not so the destruction which it inflicts. Kings are tumbled from their seats, the ties that bind nations are disrupted, and the furies of revolution and war, obedience to the summons of this invisible demon, start up to scourge mankind and desolate the earth. And so far as the papacy rules in this world, that's the desolation the earth will suffer. I'll be back tomorrow.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.